Guess what happened when a 78-year-old widow who faced a monster in the woods and called it family. In the quiet town of Hamilton, Montana, there's an old warning. If you hear 3 knocks in the night, don't open the door. But the truth is far stranger. The creature they feared, something like a young Bigfoot, wasn't violent. It once held an old woman through a blizzard, using only its body heat to keep her alive. It once saved a young girl from a predator, its roar shaking the mountain. This story is real, collected from eyewitness accounts, old police logs, and town records, now being shared for the first time. Watch to the end, and you'll discover why an entire town chose silence to protect a so-called monster, and witness the haunting ritual between a woman and a creature who only ever knocked 3 times to say, "I'm home." Anna Woodson lost everything, her husband, her son. But this creature returned her wedding ring, thought lost forever, in a way no one believed possible. If you skip this story, you may never understand why sometimes the monsters we fear are the ones who save us. The morning had teeth, not the sharp, savage kind, but dull, bone-deep, like a cold that gnaws from the inside out. Fog spilled over the canyon like something alive, crawling slow and heavy through Blodgett Canyon, swallowing the valley floor beneath it. The sky above Hamilton, Montana, hung low and pewter gray, with frost coiling around porch railings and the brittle branches of bare cottonwoods. Even the birds were quiet. At the edge of town, where gravel gave way to pine needles and silence, Anna Woodson's cabin sat half buried in mist, its wood dark from age and memory. Inside, the warmth came slow. A single iron stove groaned softly, coughing heat into the narrow room. Anna moved with care, her joints stiff and whispering, her flannel layers hanging from a frame once solid, now softened by time. She stood at the sink, drying a chipped teacup, when the knock came. 3 sharp raps. Not polite, not patient. Anna flinched. Her fingers tensed around the cup before she set it down. Her breath caught somewhere in her throat. She wasn't expecting anyone. The mailman didn't come up this far, and the few neighbors she had knew better than to show up unannounced. When she opened the door, the cold shoved in first. Then came the man. Jack Turner filled the doorway with the kind of confidence that didn't ask permission. Boots caked with mud, jacket stained with something darker. His breath billowed, eyes sharp beneath a hunter's cap. But it was what he held that stopped her breath entirely. Wrapped in an old army blanket, frayed and damp, something small shifted. A soft noise, half whimper, half growl, leaked out from beneath the cloth. Jack didn't blink. Found it by Blackwater Ridge. Damn thing was curled up near a creek bed. Thought it was a raccoon at first, but you ever seen anything like it? Anna's hands moved without thinking, reaching for the bundle. Jack let her take it, watching her face closely as she peeled back the edge. It wasn't a raccoon. It wasn't anything she'd ever seen. Tiny, maybe the size of a house cat. The creature had fur matted with mud and leaves, pale gold and soft where it wasn't tangled. Its arms were long, thin, with tiny black nails. But what struck her, what made something shift deep in her chest, were the eyes. Amber, luminous, unblinking. Eyes that looked straight through her, not with fear, but with a quiet, curious ache. Jack spoke again, his voice low, transactional. "It ain't from around here. Could be some kind of exotic pet. You know folks bring in weird things sometimes. I figure it's worth $2, maybe $300 to the right buyer." Anna didn't respond. She couldn't. She was still staring, heart hammering strangely against her ribs. The creature blinked once, then tucked its head back into the blanket, shivering. "I'll give you 20, she said softly. Jack stared. "Lady, you serious?" "I have 20, that's all." He hesitated, chewed the inside of his cheek. Then, with a shrug that said he'd already spent the money in his head, he took the bill from her hand. "Your problem now." When he left, the fog swallowed him whole. Inside, Anna stood in the center of her living room. The creature curled against her chest like a forgotten memory. She sat down in the old armchair by the stove, pulled the blanket tighter around it, and listened to the rhythm of its breath. Irregular, soft, almost like a child dreaming. She hadn't held anything like this in decades. That night, she made a bed of towels beside the stove and boiled water for oatmeal. The creature didn't eat at first, but when she dipped her finger in the bowl and held it near its mouth, it licked. Hesitant, but willing. She smiled, despite herself. "Mick," she whispered. The name came without thinking. It sounded warm, safe, like something that belonged. The days that followed settled into a quiet pattern. Strange, but tender. Mick stayed near the fire, barely moving, save for the moments when Anna touched his head and his eyes met hers. Those amber eyes, always watching, always searching. She found herself speaking to him like she had once spoken to the cat she lost 20 winters ago. Small words, gentle reassurances, as if she could will life back into her home with syllables alone. But it was something else too, something she didn't want to name. A weight in her chest beginning to lift. One morning she found him standing, wobbly, legs too long for his frame, but upright. She gasped, hand to her mouth, watching as he moved toward the window and looked out, his breath fogging the glass. There was intelligence in him, not just instinct, understanding. That evening, as the wind howled down from the canyon, Anna laid a soft knock against the wood of her door. 3 gentle taps, spaced evenly. Mick watched, listened. She repeated it, then looked at him. "You knock when you come home. 3 times, like this." She tapped again, her voice a hush over the creak of the stove. He tilted his head, then, slowly, mimicked the rhythm against the floorboards with a curled knuckle. Anna laughed. The sound surprised her, startled her even. It had been so long since she'd heard her own joy. One afternoon, while raking the last of the dry leaves from her frozen garden, she felt something hard beneath the dirt. Mick, crouched beside her, started to dig with both hands, fast, purposeful. His claws scraped, unearthed a small flash of silver. Her ring. The wedding band she'd lost years ago, after the accident. The one she'd screamed over, searched for, mourned quietly. She froze, throat closing. Mick looked up at her, dirt on his nose, and placed the ring gently in her palm. Anna didn't speak, couldn't. She just sank to her knees in the cold dirt and cried. Not the kind of crying that begged for comfort. The kind that came from remembering how to feel. That night, the fog returned, heavier than before, pressing against the windows like breath on the glass. Outside, the pines moaned in the wind. But inside, the cabin was still. Mick lay curled at her feet. Anna's hand rested lightly on his back, rising and falling with each breath. Her radio whispered an old melody she couldn't quite place, something from before, when the house had been full of voices. In the distance beyond the tree line, something called out. A low, mournful sound. Not quite a howl, not quite a voice. Mick stirred. His eyes opened. Anna held her breath, suddenly certain of one thing. He wasn't the only one out there, but he had chosen her. And for now, that was enough. The snow would come soon, and when it did, they would face it together. By the time November bled into December, Hamilton had gone quiet under its first real snowfall. The roads turned slick with black ice, and the bare trees looked like skeletons under their coats of frost. The sky remained the color of old tin, hanging low above the rooftops like it might collapse under the weight of its own silence. The cabin at the edge of town stood buried under a gentle hush, its chimney curling thin ribbons of smoke that vanished into the stillness. Inside, the fire cracked with a steady rhythm, and Anna Woodson, wrapped in wool and habit, watched the world change from her armchair, her breath slowing, matching the pace of the season. Across the room, Mick sat cross-legged on the braided rug, staring into the flames like they held answers. He wasn't small anymore. He'd grown fast. In just a few weeks, his limbs had lengthened, his torso broadening with muscle that moved with a kind of fluid tension, like something wild wearing a suit of patience. His fur, once patchy and pale, now shimmered like golden wheat in sunlight, thick and warm-looking. His face was still young, but the bones beneath had started to sharpen. He was somewhere between cub and creature now, somewhere between boy and myth. And yet, he was hers. At night, he still curled up near her chair, long arms tucked beneath his chest, breath slow and steady like a lullaby. He followed her with a devotion that made her chest ache, not out of fear or submission, but something softer, something that felt like gratitude, and something else, recognition. He understood things. He watched her in a way that said he was learning, always learning. When she cooked, he mimicked her hands. When she cleaned, he offered her items before she reached for them. And when she coughed, sharp and rattling in the cold, he would stand behind her, big enough now to press his chest to her back, lending his warmth like a living blanket. One morning, she slipped. It was early. The porch was slick with a thin sheen of frost. Her boot caught and her body folded down like old paper. The jolt sent a crack through her hip, and she gasped, the breath stolen clean out of her lungs. But before panic could rise, there he was. Mick, sudden and silent, kneeling beside her, those amber eyes wide with worry. He didn't lift her. He let her catch her breath first. Then slowly, he placed one enormous hand behind her back, the other beneath her knees, and he carried her like something sacred. Inside, he laid her on the couch with a gentleness that betrayed his size. She touched his cheek with the back of her hand, and he leaned into it, eyes fluttering shut. That night, he refused to sleep. He sat beside her like a sentry, staring out the window as the snow fell thick and relentless. Every so often, he'd glance back at her chest, making sure it still rose and fell. She didn't talk much about her pain. Not the physical kind, and certainly not the kind buried deep in the marrow of her memory. But that night, she told him. Not with words, not exactly, but with the soft cracks in her voice. About the accident, the truck, the suddenness of it. About the long ache that followed. And about the silence that took root in this house after the voices were gone. She didn't know if he understood all of it, but he listened like someone who did, like someone who carried silence in his own bones. Later that week, something strange happened. She was knitting near the window, watching the wind chase dry snow across the lawn, when she heard a soft tap at the door. 3 knocks. Deliberate, evenly spaced. Her heart skipped. She hadn't taught him that yet. She set down her yarn, stepped to the door, and opened it. There was no one there. Just the wind, just the trees. Then, from behind her, Mick padded across the room. He walked past her and stepped onto the porch, lifted one hand, knocked 3 times against the wooden frame. Not playful, not random. The exact same rhythm she'd used the week before. Her breath caught. He looked at her, and then he smiled. Not with teeth, not with lips, but with eyes that crinkled at the corners, like he knew exactly what he'd done. She didn't say a word, just nodded once, her hand tightening over her chest. From that moment on, it became their ritual. Every time he returned, from the garden, from the tree line, even just from the backyard, he'd knock 3 times. She'd open the door. No words, just the rhythm between them. A call and response. A promise. And then there was the ring. She'd stopped wearing it years ago. After the accident, it hurt too much. But she never threw it away. It vanished during one of those brutal winters when her hands were too numb to hold on to much of anything. She assumed it had slipped into the soil somewhere. Maybe out with the trash, maybe buried beneath a snowdrift. Then, one late afternoon, she found it on her nightstand. Her breath stopped. There it was. Simple, gold, a little scuffed from years of wear. But hers. No question. She turned slowly. Mick was sitting at the edge of the room, eyes downcast, hands folded. She approached, knees stiff, and crouched beside him. She held up the ring. He nodded once, then reached down and pulled something from beneath the rug. A second object, a tiny rock, smooth, flat, polished by time. He placed it in her hand beside the ring. A gift. She clutched both and lowered her forehead to his. And for the first time in years, she wept without shame. That night, she placed the ring back on her finger. It slid on like it had never left. The wind howled outside, shaking the eaves. But inside, it was warm. And for the first time in a long while, Anna didn't feel like she was waiting to die. But something else had changed, too. She'd started to notice noises, at night, mostly. Not just the creaks and groans of old wood and winter wind, but something more distant. Faint howls from the canyon, rhythmic thuds in the trees. Not every night, but enough. Mick heard them too. When they came, his ears would twitch, his head would lift. He would stand, slow and quiet, and stare toward the forest like he was listening for something she couldn't hear. And once, just once, he answered. 3 soft knocks on the window frame, then silence. She didn't ask, but she felt it. Whatever he was, wherever he'd come from, he wasn't alone. And yet every morning he was still here, still knocking, still coming home. The snow kept falling, and she let it. The cold had settled into the bones of Hamilton by the time Maria showed up. It was the kind of cold that made metal ring when you touched it, that filled your lungs like smoke and made you feel small, no matter how many layers you wore. The roads were glassy with ice, the sun no more than a pale stain behind thick clouds, and everything about the world seemed to move a little slower. Except her. Maria Woodson's car pulled up to the cabin with the urgency of someone who had played out this conversation 100 times in her head and still didn't know how it would land. Her boots crunched on frozen gravel as she stepped out, scarf pulled tight around her jaw, breath forming little bursts of white in the still air. She hadn't been up here since late summer, back when the grass still held color and Anna had sounded tired but stubborn over the phone. Maria loved her aunt, but she also worried about the way time curved around old people, how days slipped into years without anyone noticing. And something in Anna's last letter, written in that tight, looping hand, had nudged at her. Not with facts, with feeling, a kind of tremble between the lines. So she came. She knocked once, then twice more. The door opened just a crack, and there he was. Not Mick, not yet. First, Anna. She looked older, smaller, but her eyes were bright. Clearer than Maria remembered, like someone who'd been walking through fog and had finally stepped into sunlight. She hugged her niece tightly, but not with the frailty Maria expected. There was strength still in her spine, and that, somehow, worried her more. People didn't get stronger this deep into winter unless something, or someone, was helping. They sat for tea, because that's what they always did. Same chipped mugs, same cinnamon crackers that left crumbs between the pages of Anna's crossword book. For a while, Maria danced around it, asked about the garden, about the leak in the roof, about the radio that never seemed to work right. But Anna, never the one to sidestep small talk, said only, "There's someone I'd like you to meet." The moment stretched thin. Maria's grip tightened around her mug. And then, without warning, he stepped into the room. He was enormous. Taller than any man she'd ever known, even hunched as he was in the low doorway. Covered in golden fur that shimmered under the lamplight. His arms long, his legs bent at odd, graceful angles. But it was his eyes that stopped her. Not just their color. That wasn't it. It was the look, like he was studying her the same way she was studying him. Not a wild thing, not a pet. Something between. Her body locked up before her mind could catch up. The air left her lungs all at once. Her chair screeched back as she stood, heart hammering in her chest. "What is that?" she whispered. Anna didn't flinch. "He's called Mick," she said, "and he's been living here, with me." Maria's mouth opened, then shut. "No," she said. "Anna, no. This isn't a dog you found on the road. This is dangerous. He's dangerous." But Anna's voice never wavered. "He's not," she said. "He's gentle. He helps, he listens, and he's mine." Maria turned back to him. Mick. He hadn't moved. Still watching, still waiting. She grabbed her coat. She didn't even remember doing it. Just knew that the cabin felt too small, the air too thick, and she needed to be out. But before she could reach the door, there was a sound. A soft click. She looked down. At her feet, on the wood floor, sat a stone. Not just any stone. Smooth, round, clean, placed deliberately. A gift. She froze. Anna stepped closer. Her hand found Maria's shoulder. "He leaves them," she said, "when he wants to say something." Maria crouched slowly, picked it up. It was warm. That didn't make sense, but it was. And in that strange, disarming moment, something inside her started to soften. Not dissolve, not entirely, but shift. They sat again, this time in silence. Mick returned to the corner. Curled up like a child by the fire, Anna told her everything. How Jack had brought him. How she paid $20 and didn't even blink. How the nights had changed since he arrived. How her pain was quieter now. Maria listened. Her fingers turned the stone over and over again in her palm. "I don't know what this is," she said finally. "But I know you, and I've never seen you like this." Anna didn't speak. She didn't have to. Later, as Maria pulled on her coat and stepped back out into the cold, she glanced once more at the edge of the forest. A sound broke the stillness. A soft knock, 3 times. Not from the house, from the trees. She turned, eyes wide. Mick stood at the threshold, one hand lifted in parting. Maria drove down the hill in silence, but the stone stayed in her pocket. She didn't know why. Maybe she just didn't want to leave it behind. 2 days later, a neighbor named Harold Simmons, an old man with a bad back and worse binoculars, was stacking firewood when he looked up and saw something move in Anna's window. Something too tall, something not human. By the end of the week, people were whispering. By the end of the month, they were knocking on doors. Maria returned once more, this time with questions instead of panic. And Anna simply set down 2 cups of tea, stared into the fire and said, "We'll tell them what they need to hear." But not more. And when the knocking came again, 3 soft taps against the cabin door, it wasn't the sound that scared Maria. It was the way she found herself smiling when she heard it. The wind tore down Skalkaho Highway like it had something to prove, chasing loose pine needles across the frozen asphalt and rattling the brittle branches that leaned over the mountain pass. Afternoon light bled thin behind the clouds, turning the snowbanks a dull, bruised gray. Maria Woodson drove slowly, tires crunching on the icy shoulder, knuckles white against the steering wheel. The day had stretched long behind her. 6 parent-teacher meetings, 1 kid who threw up in the reading corner, and a call from the principal about budget cuts that left her stomach twisted. Her head ached. Her thermos was empty. She just wanted to get back to Anna's cabin before the road disappeared under the early dark. She didn't notice the truck behind her until it flashed its brights. Once, twice, too close. Maria checked the rear view. A big Dodge, rust eating at the hood. The kind of truck you could tell had stories, none of them good. She eased the car right, letting it pass. But it didn't. It accelerated, then slowed, then stayed, tailgating. Her breath caught. Skalkaho was no place for games. The turns were narrow. The guardrails were more rust than steel. And the drop-offs? Well, no one came back from those. She tapped the brakes. The truck didn't back off. Then it swung left, tires skidding slightly, and surged ahead to block the road. Maria slammed her foot down. Her sedan skidded to a stop, engine stalling in the sudden silence. She could hear her pulse in her ears. The truck door opened, then another, and another. 3 figures emerged. The first one, Kyle Tanner, walked like he owned the ground he stood on. Late 20s, all swagger and elbows, wearing that kind of grin that didn't mean joy. The other 2 were his usual shadows, boys who'd never outgrown the thrill of small-town fear. One wore a ball cap with the bill curled like a claw. The other had a tire iron swinging low in his grip. Kyle leaned against the hood of his truck, arms crossed. "Well," he said, voice too loud in the cold, "if it isn't Miss Bigfoot's niece." Maria said nothing. She reached slowly for her phone, hands trembling. "Relax," he smirked. "We just want to talk." His eyes didn't match his tone. The one with the hat moved closer. Maria stepped back, keys clutched tight. Then something shifted. It started as a hum in the air, a pressure behind the trees. The kind of stillness that didn't feel empty, just watched. The boys didn't notice it at first, but Kyle did. He squinted toward the pines. The wind fell silent. Then the trees bent. Not from wind, from weight. Something was moving. Fast. Heavy. Then it stepped out. Not entirely. Just enough. Just to be seen. Mick. His body gleamed under the pale light, breath fogging the air in great white gusts. He was taller than any of them. Broader. His chest rose and fell like a bellows. And his eyes, those amber eyes, locked straight onto Kyle's. Kyle stepped back. The tire iron clattered to the ground. Nobody spoke. Nobody ran. Not yet. Mick opened his mouth. Not a roar, not at first. Just a sound. Low, rumbling, like thunder held in a barrel. The kind of sound that made your insides forget what they were for. Then he roared, louder this time. Deep enough to shake the frost off the trees. Long enough to send the birds flying in a black swarm above the ridge. Kyle shouted something, but the words didn't make it out. The boy in the cap tripped over his own feet. The other one slipped on the ice, falling hard. Maria didn't move. Couldn't. But her heart didn't race. It slowed. She felt something like awe. Mick took one step forward. Just one. That was all it took. The three boys bolted, slipping, cursing, falling over themselves in their rush to get back in the truck. It roared to life, spun tires, and disappeared around the bend, exhaust trailing behind it like a curse swallowed by snow. Silence. Mick stood still for a long moment. Then he turned to her. His chest still heaving, his expression unreadable. Maria reached out a hand. He didn't take it. But he stepped closer, close enough for her to see the flecks of snow caught in his fur. She raised her hand slowly, then knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. On the side of her car. He blinked, then turned to the nearest tree, lifted a fist, and knocked 3 times back. Not loud, not soft, just right, she cried. Not like before. Not out of fear. Something else. Relief. Recognition. He vanished into the woods as quickly as he'd come. That night, Maria sat beside Anna, blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, a mug of tea untouched in her lap. She told her everything. Every word. Every sound. Every inch of what she felt when the world bent around his presence. Anna listened, then reached for her hand. "He saved me," Maria said. "No," Anna answered. "He chose you." From the trees beyond the window, a knock echoed faintly. 3 times, just enough to know they were never really alone again. Sheriff Dan Hadley didn't bother knocking. He never did. Not at Anna's place. Instead, he gave the screen door a quiet creak and stepped inside like he had 30 years ago, back when her husband was still alive and the wood stove was always burning just a little too hot. But the warmth now was different. It felt lived in, not just survival. Something had changed. He knew it before he saw it. There was a stillness in the air that wasn't the cold, a steadiness in her gaze that hadn't been there since the crash. He took off his hat and held it in his hands as he stood by the window, watching a trail of mist lift from the trees beyond the fence. They didn't speak right away. They never had to. Anna finally set down the mug she'd been holding, its rim stained with weak coffee and something sweeter. "You hear the stories?" she asked, voice soft. Dan nodded once. "Not all of them," he said, "but enough." He pulled a folded sheet from his coat. Not an official warrant, not even a warning, just a list. Names of people who had called in over the last 10 days. Some afraid, some curious, 1 or 2 sounding like they wanted to start a hunt. Anna didn't need to read it. She already knew. Dan cleared his throat, looked her straight in the eyes. "Anna," he said, quiet now. "I've been sheriff in this town long enough to know when people are starting to panic, and I've known you long enough to know you'd never bring harm here. But if this thing—" "He's not a thing," Anna said, louder than she meant to. "His name is Mick." Dan blinked. She hadn't meant to snap. But the room fell into silence like it always did when the truth got too close to shame. She looked down, fingers twitching in her lap. "I lost everything, Dan. My son, my husband. I've been sitting in this house for 20 years, talking to a radio that doesn't work, feeding birds that don't come, and now there's something here. Something kind. Something watching over me. And I won't give him up." Her voice cracked, but her back stayed straight. Maria stood in the corner, arms crossed, not saying anything yet, just listening. Dan let out a long breath and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Then tell me what you want me to do, because I can't protect what I can't explain, and the folks in town, they're spooked." It was Maria who stepped forward now, planting her boots firm on the worn floorboards. "There's a way," she said. "We treat him like what he is, not an animal, not a monster, a presence, a guardian." Dan turned to her. "And what exactly does that look like on paper?" "We don't put it on paper," she said. "We make it oral, like the old codes, something passed between people, not filed in a cabinet. We educate, tell stories, turn him into a kind of folk truth. If you want people to protect him, they need to feel like he belongs to them too." Dan chuckled under his breath. "Spoken like a teacher." She didn't smile. Anna's voice came again, quieter now. "I won't survive losing him. Not again. Not after everything." Dan's face softened. He didn't write anything down. He didn't reach for his badge. He just stepped back toward the door and looked once more toward the edge of the woods. "I used to hear stories," he said, "from my granddad, about voices in the trees, stones stacked like warnings. They called it the old tongue of the pines." Anna nodded slowly. "Mick stacks stones," she whispered, "when he's thankful." Dan turned the doorknob but didn't open it just yet. "You better keep him close. You better keep him quiet. And if it ever comes down to it, this town is going to have to make a choice." The door shut behind him with a soft click. That night the air was sharper than usual. The moon hung like a blade over the canyon rim. Anna lit the fire early, and the cabin flickered with gold. Mick lay stretched near the hearth, his long arms crossed, his chest rising and falling like waves. Maria sat beside him, humming low, barely touching the notes of a song neither of them really knew. Anna joined in softly. It was Shenandoah. Not all the words, just the ones that felt right. The river, the longing, the sound of something calling across water too wide to cross. Their voices didn't match, but it didn't matter. They weren't singing for each other. They were singing for him. Mick didn't sing, not at first, but his body moved. A slow sway, a low vibration in his throat that turned into a kind of hum, deep and layered, like earth singing back to sky. It wasn't melody. It was memory. Anna's voice cracked. Maria reached for her hand. And still, Mick hummed. The fire danced. The storm held off. Outside, near the tree line, something shifted. A shadow moved. Branches bent. But no one knocked. Not yet. Much later, when the flames were dying and the room was filled with a soft hush of breath and coal, Anna stepped outside. Just for a minute. She didn't bring a coat. Didn't need one. The cold didn't matter tonight. She stood barefoot in the snow, the hem of her nightgown brushing against frost. And on the bark of the pine beside the porch, she saw it. A smear. Shiny. Sticky. Pine resin. Fresh. She touched it, held her breath, then looked to the left. And there, just barely, she saw the shape of a boot print in the snow. Not hers, not Maria's. Too wide, too heavy, and the heel pressed down deeper than the toe. Jack Turner had been here. She didn't call out. She didn't curse. She just reached for the door handle and closed it tight behind her. It began with a silence too deep to be natural. Not the hush of snowfall or the muffled calm of a winter night. This was different, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Snow fell in sheets, thick and fast, cloaking the world in a soft, white roar. The kind of storm that erased boundaries. Roads disappeared, trees blurred into one another, and somewhere inside it all, 3 men moved like shadows through the timberline, their boots crunching crusted ice beneath them, breaths drawn tight behind their scarves. Kyle Tanner led, his gloved hand gripping the barrel of his rifle like it was a promise. The 2 others followed, one with a flashlight flickering through falling snow, the other clutching a metal rod too thin to be useful, too blunt to mean anything but harm. Behind them, they left a trail of broken twigs and heavy footprints. Just ahead, dim and warm behind frost-rimmed windows, stood the cabin. They didn't speak. Didn't need to. This wasn't a hunt born of curiosity anymore. This was spite. Fear twisted into action. Kyle had felt it since the night in the canyon, when the thing's roar had hollowed something out inside him. He couldn't sleep after that. Couldn't stop picturing those amber eyes, not full of rage, but judgment, like it had seen him down to the bone. So now he was going to put that thing down, whatever it was. Make sure the town never whispered about him like they whispered about it. Maria stood at the kitchen counter, boiling water for tea, her back to the window. Anna sat nearby, humming low, distracted by something she couldn't name. Mick lay curled near the hearth, his breathing even, but his ears twitching. His head lifted suddenly, eyes focused. Then he rose, slowly, like he'd heard something the rest of them hadn't yet. The first shot didn't break glass. It tore through air, sharp and sudden, cracking across the clearing and slicing through the storm like a whip. The window shattered. Wood splintered. Anna cried out, falling sideways as the kettle clattered to the floor. Maria dropped low, heart pounding in her ears, crawling to her aunt's side. Blood. Not much, but enough to terrify. A graze across Anna's shoulder, clean but deep, soaking through her sweater. Then the second shot came, wild, too high, and the front door buckled under force. Mick didn't run. He didn't roar. He moved like something ancient waking up. He crossed the room in 3 strides and placed himself between the women and the door just as it slammed open. Snow blew in. The wind howled. And Kyle stepped forward, rifle raised, breath fogging around his jaw. "Step aside," he barked. Mick didn't move. The boys behind him hesitated, unsure now. The plan hadn't gone like this. It wasn't supposed to bleed or breathe or stand that tall in the firelight. Anna groaned. Maria whispered something, words that didn't carry, broken by panic and wind. And then she sang. It came out without thought. The first lines of Shenandoah, soft and trembling, barely above the wind. Mick froze. His chest heaved, then lowered, and in that moment, his eyes closed. The tension dropped from his shoulders like a heavy coat. He stepped sideways, not away from the danger, but toward the fire. And that's when the sound came, from outside. Not a gun, not a scream, but something lower, deeper. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, not on the door, on a tree. The men turned, and there, just beyond the porch, barely visible through the swirling snow, stood something else. Taller than Mick, broader, covered in darker fur, soaked and glistening under moonlight. Its face was lost in shadow, but the outline said enough. The weight of it, the quiet, and the rhythm it repeated. 1, 2, 3. On the trunk of the pine, steady as a heartbeat, Kyle staggered back. The boy with the flashlight dropped it. The other one made a sound like prayer and bolted, slipping into the woods. The thing on the porch didn't advance. It simply stood, still. Watching? The storm howled louder now, swirling around the cabin like the trees were singing back. Kyle dropped his rifle, backed away, muttering something about being tricked, about no one believing this, about nightmares that walked on 2 legs. He didn't get far before headlights cut through the trees. Sheriff Hadley's truck skidded into the clearing, tires grinding into snowpack, red and blue lights flashing muted behind the storm. Dan stepped out slowly, hand resting on his hip. eyes scanning the scene. He didn't look shocked. He looked tired. He walked past Kyle, past the boys, and knelt beside Anna, checked the wound, then looked to Maria, then to Mick. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Go get the med kit." Maria did. By the time she returned, the figure in the woods was gone. No prints, no movement, only the trees, and 3 faint knocks echoing through the trunks. Later, after the bleeding stopped and the fire was stoked again, Dan sat at the table, boots wet, shoulders heavy. He spoke softly. "To the town, I'll call this reckless discharge of a firearm. A fine, maybe probation." He looked at Anna. "But I think we all know this wasn't just that." Anna nodded, eyes glassy with something too big for words. "Mick didn't attack," Maria said. "He didn't have to," Dan replied. Then he looked toward the window, toward the dark beyond the glass. "From now on," he said, "this town doesn't talk. Not to outsiders, not to game wardens, not to anyone." "And if they do?" Maria asked. He stood. "They won't." The wind had calmed by then, but the air was still thick with something ancient and humming. Something not gone, just waiting. Outside, under the porch light, Mick stepped into the snow. He knelt beside the porch steps and placed a stone there. Not smooth, not perfect, but whole. A reminder, a vow. The storm had passed, but the weight of it stayed behind. They held the meeting in the old Hamilton Community Hall, the one with warped floorboards and a crooked picture of Reagan still hanging near the front like he'd been watching this town fall apart for decades. Outside, the wind combed hard through the pine, and snow flicked against the windows like tiny fists. Inside, the wood stove groaned, the overhead lights buzzed, and every chair in the room was full. Farmers, retirees, young parents with restless kids tugging at their sleeves. You could feel the tension in the coats folks kept on, not from cold, from not knowing which way the room might turn. Sheriff Hadley stood at the front, arms folded. His face was unreadable. The kind of calm that comes from walking into too many messes and knowing full well there isn't a way out that leaves everyone clean. Beside him stood Maria, shoulders squared, notes in her pocket but no intention of reading them. And Anna, standing straighter than she had in years, her eyes clear, hands trembling only a little. No one spoke at first. Not really. There was too much weight hanging in the silence. Then it started. Murmurs from the back. Sharp whispers rising like steam. What if it comes into town? My kids walk that road every day. Is it even human? Why's she hiding it? Then a voice cut through. Older, firm, from the front row. Margaret Stowe, mid-70s. Ran the library for 40 years and scared more children than the ghost stories she read aloud. You said he saved her. That true? Maria nodded. He stepped between me and a loaded rifle. He didn't attack. He just stood. And they ran. Another voice, skeptical. That's not what Kyle said. Then Kyle's lying, came a voice from the corner. Heads turned. It was Walter Pierce, a logger with hands like bricks and a limp from a chainsaw accident 20 years back. He didn't smile often, but when he did, it meant something. Boys like him don't back down from a raccoon, but whatever they saw that night made them throw down their guns and run like children. Silence again, then another voice, gentler. My boy said he saw something by the edge of the creek, said it left him a rock. Heads turned. A murmur stirred. What do you mean? Someone asked. The woman pulled something from her coat. A small stone, smooth, with a natural stripe of quartz running through it like a thread of frost. She set it on the table. He told me it was a gift. Another voice. A man in his 50s. Saw the same thing near my hunting cabin. Couple of stones, stacked neat, like a marker. Didn't think much of it. Then someone else. You think that's how they talk? My granddad used to say the old ones would knock when they meant peace. Knock when they came near. Knock when they left. More murmurs, pieces clicking into place. The room was shifting, not all at once, but slowly, like a river changing course. Maria stepped forward, steady now. He's not a monster. He's not a pet. He's something else, something old, something that chose to protect rather than harm. But the rest of the world wouldn't see it that way. They'd drag him out, cage him, dissect him, parade him like a trophy. Unless we stopped them. Someone stood. It was Earl Jensen, Vietnam vet, barrel-chested and quiet. He raised a hand, as if voting before speaking. "We keep quiet," he said. "We treat it like a wildfire, local, handled, ours." Sheriff Hadley didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "If this town is going to do this, if we're going to protect what we don't understand, then we do it all the way. No hunting parties, no loose talk, no media. If you see signs, stacked stones, 3 knocks, you turn around. That means you're too close. That's the agreement." An older man near the back cleared his throat. "And what if someone breaks it?" Dan met his eyes. "Then they're not one of us anymore." The wind howled outside again, a gust that shook the windows. But the room didn't flinch. Something had settled. A kind of pact, not written, not signed, but solid. The meeting ended without a vote. No one needed one. That night, as people filed out in silence, some offered nods to Anna. Others touched her shoulder. One woman pressed a small bag of cookies into Maria's hand. No one asked questions. No one mentioned Mick by name. When Anna returned home, she stepped onto the porch and stopped. Her breath caught. Dozens of small stones had been placed at the foot of the steps, stacked neatly, carefully, some in towers, some in circles, a few with little sprigs of pine tucked between them. The wind had blown snow across them, dusting the rocks like powdered sugar. But they held. Every single one. She opened the door slowly. Mick was waiting. He looked at her, then down at her hand. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out one of the stones, one with a line of iron red running through it like a thread of blood. She placed it beside the others. He picked it up, turned it once in his palm. Then he stepped forward, reached into his chest pouch and pulled something small. Her wedding ring, again. He placed it in her hand. She didn't cry this time. She just closed her fingers around it, pressed it to her heart, and whispered, "Thank you." Not with her mouth, with her whole being. From the tree line there was a soft sound. 3 slow, low knocks. And then nothing but the hush of falling snow and the warmth of a home that had decided, once and for all, what it was willing to protect. The first snow of December came like a closing door. Thick, sudden, unforgiving. By mid-morning, the entire Bitterroot Valley lay under a shroud of white, and Hamilton looked like a town forgotten by time, rooftops sagging under the weight, power lines humming low, and the sky pressing in heavy and gray. Nothing moved, not the wind, not the trees, just silence, pure and sealed, like the world had finally decided to rest. Anna Woodson stood at the window in her faded robe, one hand resting against the frosted glass, the other gripping her cane a little too tight. Her breath fogged a small circle in front of her, and in that circle she watched snow fall in slow motion, as if each flake had to ask permission to land. She didn't know what made her step outside that morning. Maybe it was the way the light hit the porch, all diffused gold against the drift. Or maybe it was the quiet. That kind of quiet that calls to something deeper inside a person, something primal and aching. She didn't even put on boots, just shuffled in her wool socks, slow and careful, her cane sinking into the fresh powder with each step. She made it to the yard before the ice caught her. It wasn't dramatic. There was no scream. Just a soft gasp, a sudden drop, and the kind of thud that made your bones feel it even if you didn't hear it. She landed hard. Her shoulder twisted, her back jolted, and for a long moment she couldn't move, couldn't cry out, just stared at the pale sky while the snow fell into her hair, into her mouth, into her silence, and then warmth. Not just temperature, presence. Mick. He was there before she knew she'd called for him. Not with sound, but something deeper. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He just dropped to one knee beside her, those massive hands hovering over her body like they didn't know what part to fix first. He tilted his head, those amber eyes scanning every inch of her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Then, without a word, He lifted her. Gently, slowly, cradled her like glass. She didn't flinch, didn't wince. She just let her head fall against his chest and listened to the way his breath matched hers. Inside, he placed her on the couch, covered her with the old quilt she hadn't used since Harold passed. She could barely speak, but when he reached for her hand, she saw it. Her wedding ring. He held it like he understood its weight. Not just the metal, the memory. He placed it in her palm again. Third time. No ceremony, no explanation. Just the slow closing of her fingers around it. And in that moment, it felt like a circle had closed. Not in grief, in healing. Later, when the house grew still again and the fire crackled its old rhythm, she looked to the window, and she saw him. Not Mick, the other one. The taller one, the elder. He stood in the tree line, half shrouded by falling snow, barely visible. But she knew, from the way he held his shoulders, from the calm in his stillness. He lifted one hand, tapped a tree, 3 times. Clear, low, measured, and then he was gone. Vanished into the pines like a whisper you weren't sure you'd heard. That night, the whole town seemed to exhale. People stayed in, lights dimmed early. Roads lay untouched, and from behind frosted glass, several saw something they didn't speak of in the morning. A shape, tall, still, watching. But no one called the sheriff. No one reached for a gun, because in the heart of every person who had sat in that hall a week ago, something had shifted. A truth had been agreed upon, not out loud, but deep down. And so they watched her window, Anna's, and when they saw her face appear there, tired but steady, smiling faintly behind the glass, they knew she had made it through, and more than that, she had found peace. Not in solitude, not in forgetting, but in being chosen. Outside her window, the snow kept falling, and beneath it, Mick sat still, head tilted to the trees, listening, not for danger, for memory. And far beyond the trees, in the silence that only deep winter can hold, something knocked again, 3 times, a language no one had taught, but everyone had come to understand. Sometimes, the most extraordinary things don't arrive with thunder or fanfare. They come quietly, wrapped in snow, or tucked between the trees, or standing just outside the door, waiting for someone brave enough to open it. This was never a story about monsters. It was about what we choose to protect and what we allow ourselves to believe in when the world tries to harden us. It reminds us that family isn't always written in blood, and love doesn't always speak in words. Sometimes it knocks, softly, patiently, in rhythms only the heart understands. And healing, it doesn't come all at once. It comes in small gestures, in warmth shared during a storm, in eyes that see us when we've long stopped seeing ourselves. We live in a time that moves fast, that rewards noise, that forgets how to be still. But somewhere in the silence, beyond fear, beyond judgment, there's a space where understanding grows, where stories like this still matter, because they carry something we're all quietly aching for. Connection, trust, forgiveness. The kind that doesn't ask who you are, only how you treat the ones who are lost, and the ones who show up when no one else will. Maybe that's the lesson buried in the snow, whispered through the trees, carried in 3 soft knocks we almost miss if we're not paying attention. That even in a world that often feels broken, there are still places, still people, willing to hold on to wonder, to mercy, to the unexplainable. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Thank you so much for walking through this story with me. If it moved you, sparked something, or simply gave you a moment of peace, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the warmth by hitting that follow button. You never know who might need a story like this tonight.